Greetings and welcome to this second lecture on Socrates. And I hope my voice comes across okay. I lost a crown in my mouth about an hour ago. So I am minus one tooth for now until I get over to the dentist, but we'll see how that goes. When I left you, I talked about Socrates and I talked about how he fits into this notion of being more of a moral philosopher. He's not really a political philosopher, but certainly he is worthy of discussing. The boundary line between Socrates and Plato is very vague. I'll talk about that more later on. Your book, as I mentioned, compares Socrates to Jesus as teachers, both threatening the political status quo, both being unjustifiably put to death. Um, and I told you that even though Socrates is seen as kind of the antithesis of the sophists, certainly he did agree with them on some things, such as the study of human behavior should be at the center of study rather than the universe. They both agreed that the purpose of life was finding happiness. And when I left you at the end of the last tape, I told you the big difference was the sophists believed that happiness is found through excellence in human activity. So if you are an athlete, it's winning awards. If you are a teacher, it's perhaps being recognized by your peers, but it's excelling at an occupation. Socrates did not disagree with this. He said certainly you can find happiness through excellence in human activity, but it is an inferior form of happiness. So the key then is when we look at Socrates, what is better than that? Now remember, and put some stars here in your notes, or write a note to yourself that Socrates, like Plato, and to a lesser degree like Aristotle, they employ normative theory. Remember, with normative theory, they're much more interested in what should be rather than what is. So for Socrates, if the purpose of human existence, right, figure out what it is and how the good life can be achieved. And for Socrates, the good life was interacting in a just and ethical way. It was being a good person, and that the good society would emerge if human beings were taught justice and ethics and philosophy. Now, in this sense, Socrates believes that the environment is a prime motivator of human behavior. And notice what he's saying here, and I didn't write this in the notes, but the assumption obviously is that if you improve the environment in which people live, and if you teach them the right things, people can and will become better. And so, in that sense, morality and philosophy should be at the center of learning, and that should be internalized into the human soul. So, Socrates is interested in what should be, living the just or ethical life. He obviously is saying this is not occurring under the sophists. Remember, the sophists are out there teaching people how to be successful in political society. They're interested in persuasion, not the truth. And Socrates is saying that's what's wrong with society, that we're not teaching things like truth and justice. Instead, it's persuasion and demagoguery. So for Socrates, and I would put some stars here in your notes, the highest form of happiness is the cultivation of the human soul. That true happiness will occur for people if they pursue the good life, which is attained by living their lives in accordance with ethical principles. So certainly this is a direct repudiation of the sophists. Remember, the sophists are saying, here's the way you get ahead in society. And Socrates is saying that that's completely wrong. That in this particular case, you should pursue justice and truth and becoming a better person. He's, that the old saying, and I have it in parentheses, the unexamined life is not worth living, certainly, I think, is an apt description of Socrates. As I mentioned at the start of this mini lecture, materialism can give happiness, but it's an inferior form of happiness. That knowledge and truth are the highest values. It's not power or persuasion or rhetoric, it's knowledge and truth, and that individual behavior should be guided by reasonable ethical standards. And notice that we are not equating ethics with legality. At times, ethical standards may mean violating state laws. So if you think, for example, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King and others, right, were engaged in demonstrations that in some cases the state deemed illegal. But in that particular case, that passive disobedience was for justice, in this case, desegregating Southern society. So Socrates, even though he was told to quit teaching, that if you keep teaching, we're going to charge you for corrupting the youth, Socrates refused to stop, even though he was warned, because Socrates believed that his teaching was ethical and that it was just, and that the lessons he was teaching were the right ones. And so Socrates is kind of seen in the Western world as the leader of this civil disobedience movement. There is a very nice box in your textbook talking about civil disobedience. I will put a question on the exam about civil disobedience. This is the refusal to obey governmental demands or commands. They are especially seen as nonviolent. They are usually seen as collective, meaning that it is not an individual pursuit, it is a social pursuit within society with the goal of forcing concessions from the government. Once again, the assumption of those practicing civil disobedience is that there is a higher personal code, that the laws or customs of the state, certainly they are important, but at times they are unjust. And so your textbook gives great examples, right? Thoreau refused to pay taxes over his objection to slavery, for example, and the Mexican-American War, which Thoreau believed was an unjust war that the United States had started. Looking back today, it would appear that Thoreau was right, that slavery was immoral and repugnant. And the evidence suggests that people like Henry David Thoreau and Abraham Lincoln, who both said that the United States and President Polk had provoked the Mexican-American War, the preponderance of evidence suggests that that is true. Certainly, Gandhi leading the salt strikes, and his passive disobedience is often credited with gaining Indian independence from Great Britain, even though at the time Gandhi was a very controversial figure, and even though his activity was illegal. Certainly, in Political Science 1201, when I teach American government, I talk about Dr. Martin Luther King, along with Rosa Parks, and the beginning of King's movement with the Montgomery bus boycott, where Rosa Parks engaged in civil disobedience. She was fined $13 for refusing to give her seat up to a white man. She was fined $13. It led to a 381-day boycott of the bus lines led by a young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the boycott ended because the U.S. Supreme Court eventually stepped in and ruled that the bus policy in Montgomery, Alabama was illegal, was unconstitutional, and that the bus lines had to desegregate. Uh, Socrates takes what I wrote down as a conformist view of the state. So this is one that I alluded to earlier. According to Plato, a friend of Socrates comes to him with a plan to escape. So Socrates could have escaped. But Socrates says something very intriguing, and I've already confessed that Socrates is a better man than me. If I had had the ability to escape, I think I would have done so. But Socrates states that escaping would be unjust. And the reason it would be unjust is because he had an obligation as a citizen to accept his punishment, even though in this case, the punishment of death appears to be incredibly excessive for his teaching. I underlined in the notes that Socrates believed that it is better to be the recipient of a major injustice than to commit a minor injustice yourself. And I'll make a parallel that is not in your book with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He says something that has a similar theme, although it's worded very, very different. Dr. King said in this particular case that civil disobedience had to be nonviolent, because if he and his followers were to become violent, then they would be engaged in an injustice, and they are fighting injustice, and they would become part of the evil that they're protesting against. So Dr. King stressed the notion, like Socrates and like Gandhi, that in this particular case, do not engage in minor injustices yourself, even if the injustices or injustice that you are battling is far greater than the ethical breach that you may be committing. So don't do it. If you believe there's injustice, do not engage in an injustice to try to rectify that. And so I find it intriguing. As I mentioned, Socrates was sentenced to death by 6 votes, a jury of 500. And it's a rather sad story. And of course, as you can imagine, Plato is going to have a huge chip on his shoulder when he looks at Athenian democracy. And this Athenian democracy resulted in the death of his teacher. I will conclude with the bottom of the notes there that for Socrates, individuals can only find happiness removed and distant from the state. In this case, he says something intriguing, and I want you to think about it. Because is this true in modern democratic society today? Does Socrates have something to say about American politics? Because here is what he says. Socrates says that a successful political career requires individuals to surrender their core ethical principles. And therefore, you should not be a political creature. Because if you become a political creature, you no longer can be a moral creature. Do politicians surrender their moral creed when they enter the modern political arena? It is an intriguing question, and it's not one that I want to answer right now, but it's one that I want you to think about. So once again, when we look at Socrates, he is a moral, he is not a political philosopher, although he does have some things, very negative things, about politics. In our next mini lecture, we move away from moral philosophy to our first political philosopher, a student of Socrates named Plato. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Take care of yourself. See you soon. Bye.